The countdown to Halloween has finally begun. For all of us horror fans out there, October truly is the best month of the year. And we want to give you unrivaled creepy content, so please enjoy a few hours worth of creepy ghost photos, sightings, stories and videos. You're definitely going to want to get cozy, grab some snacks, hit those lights and enjoy this one. Now before we get in, we'd just like to say a massive thank you to this compilation sponsor, Surfshark VPN. Chances are you're a fan of top 5s, and you've probably got a knack for late night investigations in all corners of the internet. Whether it's deep dives into the unknowns of the universe, or binging the newest mystery thriller series on your favourite streaming service, you probably spend a good amount of time online. But what if we told you there was a safe way to do so? In addition to an opportunity to access the web from any location in the world, no strings attached. With Surfshark VPN, these incredible possibilities are delivered directly to you in the simplest ways possible, letting you evolve into a top-tier internet sleuth. One of Surfshark's greatest keys is its ability to unlock access to servers from anywhere on Earth. Whether it be the United States, the United Kingdom or even East Asia, surf the web in any country in any time zone. This means your favourite television shows and digital programming that's only available in certain territories are now available on your own streaming service accounts like Netflix or Amazon Prime. Just switch servers on the VPN to a country of your choice, and entirely new libraries will be at your viewing disposal, on an unlimited number of devices too. There's also an additional level of security as well, so if protecting your data and information is a priority, Surfshark VPN uses industry-leading encryption to secure your data, keeps your browser history confidential, and automatically blocks over 1 million known virus hosting websites and other phishing threats. It may sound too convenient to be true, but we promise that's just the tip of the iceberg. For a limited time, use our code TOP5s upon checkout to unlock a brilliant 83% discount, along with 3 months free and a 30-day money-back guarantee. Easily the best price on the VPN market. So what are you waiting for? Grab your magnifying glass, shut those Venetian blinds, and become a better sleuth with Surfshark VPN. River Pool Spirit. Jared from Guatemala in Central America sent us this first one. Jared and his family live in the city, but his mother owns some land just outside of the city. The area is remote and has lush green landscapes and clean rivers, and Jared and his family go there to stay at least once a year. Well, about 1 kilometre away from the cottage they stay in is a natural river pool known as Rettery. That is a perfect place for the family to go for a swim. Although the pool is a little dangerous as it's very deep in places. One day, Jared and his brother were alone in the river pool, just swimming, messing around in the water and taking photos. At the time, nothing out of the ordinary happened. However, when they went back home to the city, they had a look over the photographs they had taken at the river and noticed something strange. It appeared that they were not alone, as they thought. In one of the photographs, you can see what looks like a little boy's head poking out of the water. Take a look. Jared knows he and his brother were alone that day, and what makes it even more creepy is that there are countless stories of people who have drowned in that river, and lots of stories about children who have gotten into difficulty in the pool and lost their lives. Jared believes that he captured the spirit of a child who drowned in the pool. What do you think? Screaming Spirit. This photograph was sent in by a subscriber from Washington County in southern eastern Ohio who wishes to remain anonymous, so we'll call him S. The photo was taken by his sister. Before we show it to you, here is a bit of background. S's sister, who we'll call B, and her fiancé T were renting a small house. The house was located just outside of Marietta, Ohio. Marietta is the oldest town in Ohio and has a history of strange goings-on and hauntings, and is said to be built on top of numerous Native American burial grounds, some of which are still visible today. B was due to get married, but a few months before the wedding, sadly T's grandfather passed away. It was his dying wish that all of his belongings would be distributed amongst his family, and B and T inherited a few things, mostly furniture. Shortly after bringing the new items into their home, they began to paint and retile their kitchen. However, during the redecoration, strange things started to happen around the house. T's clothes would be mysteriously laid out for him on the floor, cups would fall out of closed cabinets, and things would be thrown across the room. At the time, the couple didn't think too much of it and continued with their decorating. B took some photos of the home, most notably of the kitchen, and sent them over to T's mother as a way of showing her their progress and usage of the newly acquired furniture and decor. However, in one of the photographs, her soon-to-be mother-in-law noticed what looked like an anguished face near the window. She asked B what it was, believing that she may be fooling around or trying to scare her. It's worth noting that S told us his sister is not like that. She is very kind-hearted and good-natured, and to pretend to capture a ghost, especially after a death in the family, is something that would never cross her mind. The strangest thing about this image is that when T's grandfather passed, those family members who were with him said that when the time came, he began to panic and scream, saying he wasn't ready. What do you make of the image? Creepy tunnels. Enzo shared 2 photographs with us that he took on a holiday in Italy. At first glance, there isn't anything particularly scary about them until you know the background. About 4 years ago, Enzo was in Italy with his parents, staying in a location where lots of battles took place during World War I. The area was scattered with abandoned bunkers, and one day Enzo and his father went to investigate one of them. They walked quite deep into the structure, and as they walked through the halls, they noticed a lot of entrances were cemented off so no one could get trapped. However, when they walked into one of the tunnels, there were 2 ways to go, both going left. They decided to take the furthest away. But as they walked towards it, suddenly a mist came out of the tunnel and moved towards the wall before disappearing in front of their eyes. Enzo and his father were very unnerved as they were deep inside the bunker, so wondered where the mist could come from. They both ran out of the bunker as fast as they could. However, Enzo was lucky enough to capture 2 photographs, one that shows the clear bunker and the other with a mist. But the story doesn't end there. Later that night, when they were back at their hotel, Enzo's father was awoken in the middle of the night when Enzo's stuffed animal toy was randomly thrown at him. His father was scared and woke his wife, and they both checked the room to see if there was any way Enzo could have thrown the toy in his sleep, but soon realized the proximity of his bed, compared to theirs, meant there was no way he could have thrown it without injuring himself. Soon after, his shaken dad went to the bathroom to freshen up and calm down, and decided to leave the bathroom light on. But as he made his way back to the bed, he heard a loud click and the bathroom light turned itself off. It's fair to say Enzo's mother and father had a fairly restless night after that. Spooky silent 999 call. This was sent in by Johnny, who back in the early 2000s was working as a policeman in Scotland. One night shift, at around 4 AM, Johnny and his colleague received a radio call from a control room to attend a silent 999 call. A silent 999 is fairly common, and is basically when someone dials 999 but doesn't respond or give any information as to the nature of the call. The majority of these calls are young children who are taught to dial 999 in emergencies and decide it would be fun to give it a try. Often the police show up at a house and an embarrassed parent would answer the door, apologizing for their children who had dialed the number. In this case, the silent 999 came from a local inn. Johnny and his colleagues drove to the inn, that was a pub and accommodation with half a dozen rooms upstairs. The place was in darkness and all was quiet. They did an external check of the building, and Johnny radioed the control center to contact the key holder to the building. As luck would have it, the owner/key holder lived in the bungalow right next to the inn. As she unlocked the door, she explained that there were no residents staying, as it was off-season and there was no one in the building. The 2 policemen conducted a thorough search of the building and all of the rooms, but found nothing. Johnny contacted control again and asked them to elaborate on the silent 999 call. The controller explained she could hear someone breathing on the other end of the call, but not speaking or making any other noise. She said the call was terminated by the caller and was very crackly. However, she was unable to say if it was male or female. Johnny then asked her to confirm the originating phone number, which she read out over the radio. Johnny then repeated the telephone number to the owner of the inn, as she had guided them to the only external line in the place, which was behind the bar. However, the numbers did not match. Johnny noticed at that moment the owner went deathly white in the face and asked Johnny to repeat the number. She then said, "Follow me." She escorted both Johnny and his colleague down into the cellar. There was a large cold storeroom where all the beer kegs and other chilled bottles were stored. She took them across to the opposite side of the room where an old bureau was sat. She opened the bottom drawer and produced one of those old rotary-style phones. It was yellowed with age and clearly hadn't been used for some time. She then pointed to an old phone line on the wall and said that back in the 80s, the old phone was connected there and it used to sit on the desk. The phone number was written on the middle of the rotary mechanism and had a clear plastic cover on it. It was the number from which the silent 999 call had come from. To this day, they have no idea who called or how this was even possible. Skinwalker Ranch Experience. This story was sent in by Maddie. It's not her personal experience, but something that happened to her dad, who we'll call H. H hauls crude oil in southeastern Utah and works very close to the infamous Skinwalker Ranch. When he first started with the company, he and his family were required to watch a documentary on the Skinwalker Ranch, so they were aware of the strange things that happened in the area. H was also warned that if he sees anything out there, smells rotting flesh, or hears strange sounds, he is to shut down his pump and get back into his truck immediately. H went along with the warnings, but didn't really believe any of the stories. A few months later, he was training a new driver, who we'll call Mike, who he had to supervise and offer advice when necessary. Mike hooked up the hose to the tanker trailer, and the two men stood beside the truck, keeping an eye on the pump and waiting for it to fill the tanker, which normally took about half an hour. As they stand there talking, suddenly both men went silent at the same time. They both smelled the unmistakable scent of rotting meat. Immediately, H told Mike to shut down the pump, and both men got into the truck and locked the doors. It was nighttime, so they were in complete darkness. As they sat in the truck, H thought he heard someone whisper his name, and as he looked out of the truck window, he saw a huge wolf-like creature. Both men were terrified, but they knew the protocol, so stayed still and quiet. By now, the smell of rotting flesh was overwhelming, making them feel sick. The wolf apparently circled the truck twice, and on its third trip around, H again heard something saying his name, and the voice sounded like Maddie's mum. He instinctively looked to where the voice was coming from, but as he turned his head, he came eye to eye with the wolf. It was standing on its hind legs and was staring straight at him with glowing eyes. The creature called his name again, but this time H resisted looking, and instead focused on the dash of the truck, and out of the corner of his eye, he saw the wolf get back down on its legs, and the smell disappeared. The two men sat in the truck in stunned silence for about 10 minutes, before getting out and finishing the pump. As they were finishing up, H looked at the opposite ridge, and on top of the hill to the left, he could see the outline of a giant wolf in the moonlight. About a month later, H worked the same well, but this time he was alone. As he waited for the truck to fill, he phoned Maddie's mum. But whilst he was talking to her, he heard a really strange sound, like someone was running their fingernails on the other side of his trailer. He grabbed a metal rod and walked around the front of the truck. Forgetting the protocol of getting in the truck, if he heard strange noises, he went to investigate, and found 3 thin scratches that led from the middle of the huge chrome trailer to the bottom. The scratches were as tall as him. However, in the darkness, H couldn't make out any footprints, so he shrugged it off as him being paranoid because he was alone in the middle of nowhere. He went back to the pump and realised how quiet it had gone. The only sounds he could hear was the pump and his own breathing. Suddenly he heard a hiss from above, on the top of the tanker. Although it didn't sound like an animal hissing, it sounded more like a backwards, distorted record. H looked up and saw what looked like a broken in half sideways human that was covered in spikes. He backed away from the trailer as he stared up at this thing, and its white eyes shone back at him. He didn't know what to do, so just stood there. After about a minute, the creature made the same distorted sound and jumped off the other side of the trailer. However, in less than 10 seconds, H could see the creature standing on the same hill that he had previously seen the wolf on. How it got there in such a short space of time, he had no idea. As H stood and stared at the creature, it crouched down and changed. At first the outline looked like a bird, then a deer, then a wolf. It then stood up on its hind legs and walked off to the other side of the ridge. This was the last straw for H, and he refused to work at that particular well again, and to this day has never gone back. About a year after the incidents, H was asked to train another driver at a different well that was also close to the ranch. Just as the two men finished pumping and got back into the truck, their ears popped at the same time. The trainee who was driving missed a gear, and he stopped the truck. H turned to him, but as he tried to speak, no sound came out. The two men sat in the truck and stared down at the ranch, and they could see a huge light rising from the center of it that looked like someone had just set off a huge firework. The light exploded about 200 feet off the ground, and they just watched as a green wave made its way across the sky towards their truck before stopping just before it reached them. As the green light faded, everything appeared to come back, and the truck started revving so much it was on the verge of overheating. The trainee quickly put the truck into gear and left the area as fast as they could. The next day, he apparently quit. Not long after H found out that a family who lived in a trailer house about a mile from the ranch had recently vanished. Apparently the children had missed several days of school, prompting concerned family members to go and check on them. When they arrived, they found all of the livestock slaughtered, with their bellies ripped open. Inside the trailer, they found the TV still on, pots still on the stove full of old food, and food still on the table. One of the chairs was knocked over, but there was no trace of the family. H doesn't think that there were any investigations into where the family went, because it is not unusual for families who live in close proximity of the ranch to disappear. H still works for the company, but he works during the day now. His co-workers continue to experience strange things when working at the two wells closest to Skinwalker, and several refuse to haul in that area. Maddie's dad told her he believes he met the same Skinwalker on both occasions. He has no explanation for what he saw, but he won't go anywhere near the place at night again. What do you make of this experience? Fort Nelson Apparition. This first creepy image was sent in by Keith. It was taken in 2008 by his partner who had visited Fort Nelson underground tunnels in Portsmouth, UK. Just to give a bit of history about the tunnels, they lay beneath Fort Nelson, one of 5 defensive fortifications built on Portsdown Hill in the mid-19th century, at a time when Britain was still concerned about a potential French invasion. The fort looks over Portsmouth Naval Base and Dockyard. The fort was once manned by over 200 garrison volunteers, along with regular army officers, and although it was never used for its original purpose, it did play an important role in both the First and Second World Wars, as barracks for troops waiting to be deployed to the front line in the First World War, and as an anti-aircraft ammunition supply depot during the Second World War. Nevertheless, after the wars, the building was abandoned in the 1950s. Today, Fort Nelson acts as a museum that is home to the Royal Armoury's National Collection of Artillery and Historic Cannons, and it receives thousands of visitors each year. But perhaps the eeriest part of the site is the underground tunnels that lie beneath the fort that have long been reputed to be haunted, and the spooky dark maze that previously stored ammunition is now a paranormal hotspot. Some of the spirits that allegedly haunt the area are a whistling sergeant major who can be heard patrolling the grounds, a little drummer boy, and a large 7-foot-tall male spirit who has been seen walking around with a lantern. Another spooky tale involves a female prostitute who came to the fort to visit male soldiers, who met her death at the hands of a soldier, and whose spirit has lingered ever since. So when Keith's partner explored the tunnels with her mother back in 2018, they were prepared for the unexpected, but were shocked at what they saw when they looked back over the photos they had taken that day, and realised they were not alone in the tunnel, as they had first thought. Take a look. Now it could just be another visitor, although there were only 3 people down in the tunnels that day, so unless another one sneaked in unseen, the figure at the end of the tunnel is a mystery. What we can tell you is that the image is 100% genuine, so could that be the apparition of one of the many ghosts that reportedly haunt the tunnels? Or is there another explanation? What do you think? Lights playing tricks. Ryan and his family have experienced several weird experiences over the years, and we thought we would share a couple of them to see if any of you can relate to them. At Ryan's childhood home, his parents had a huge cupboard that came in 2 pieces. The upper half was a glass display cabinet with a light that turned on and off with a touch button. The cupboard stayed in the home without incident for 11 years, during which time Ryan's mother was diagnosed with cancer. While she was going through treatment, Ryan's grandparents spent weeks living with them to take care of the family and help their daughter out, even though they lived 5 hours away. The whole family became closer as a result, and thankfully Ryan's mother made a full recovery. However, sadly 2 years later, Ryan's grandmother passed away, but his grandfather continued to visit. That is when things got a little weird. Every time Ryan's grandfather was in the house, the light from the cupboard turned on by itself. His family became convinced it was their grandmother making her presence felt every time her husband visited. And in a way, it was comforting for them. What made it even stranger was the light would come on even when it wasn't plugged in, and this has continued randomly ever since. A similar thing happened to Ryan's dad, who Ryan points out is a bit skeptical about a lot of paranormal stories. However, on this occasion he was completely freaked out. Ryan's dad was visiting him at school in California, where Ryan was playing basketball. He checked into the DoubleTree Hotel in Norwalk, California during his visit, a hotel that as far as we can tell has no paranormal history. On the last night, Ryan's dad was asleep in his room when he woke up in the middle of the night and realised that he'd left the light on near the door, so he got up and turned it off and went back to sleep. He woke up an hour later and the light was switched back on. He was sure that he had turned it off, but he got back up again and turned it off. But as soon as he got back into bed and turned away from the door, the light switched back on. Thinking there was a fault with the light or the switch, he got out of bed again and checked over the fitting, but all seemed fine. He got back into bed, rolled over, and the light switched on again. By now he was getting slightly nervous. It was the middle of the night, and this light seemed to have it in for him. Again he switched the light off, but this time when he got back into the bed, he stared at the light switch to see what happened. He did this for over an hour, but as soon as he turned away to try and get some sleep, the light switched back on. He then got the feeling something was in the room, and got so spooked out that he packed up his things and left at 4 AM in the morning. He later told Ryan the light turning on wasn't the biggest issue. It was the fact that the switch kept flipping on its own, despite him switching it off numerous times. What do you think? Unexplained ball of light. This next bit of footage was sent in by one of our patrons, Courtney, who lives with her boyfriend Dan in Spokane, Washington. It was late at night and Dan was fast asleep, but Courtney was awake and thought she could hear someone talking outside as well as distant footprints, so she got out of bed to check if it was her neighbour coming home. Courtney looked out of her bedroom window that was in the basement into the front yard but could see nothing, but when she checked the backyard she saw this and videoed it on her phone. Take a look. Now, when we first looked at it, we thought it was an outside light, but Courtney confirmed there is no outside light in the backyard, only motion sensor lights that had come on in the background, so there was no explanation for the bright ball of light outside the dining room. Slightly freaked out by the light, Courtney and Dan tried to recreate it another night to see if it was a light being shone from outside or inside. However, they found it impossible to recreate anything resembling the ball of light Courtney videoed. This is a recent occurrence, and the couple still don't know if someone was shining a light into their home from outside, or whether there was an intruder inside their house that night. Now, we aren't saying this is anything sinister, but we do not know what could have caused such a bright ball of light. If any of you have any ideas, I know Courtney and Dan would be very grateful, and if there is an innocent explanation, they will probably rest easier in their beds tonight. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. A step back in time. This story, we feel a lot of people can relate to. It was sent in by Martin from Auckland, New Zealand. Back in early 2014, Martin attended his great-uncle's funeral at Manaku Memorial Gardens. After the service, the family gathered for the wake in a building next door. It was a very hot day, so Martin stepped outside to get some fresh air, when something extraordinary happened. As soon as he stepped outside, he saw himself as a young boy running past him into the car park and up towards the graveyard. Martin decided to follow the boy, but as soon as he did, he heard the voice of his grandfather, but when he looked around there was no one there. Martin continued to follow the boy, who led him to the gravesite of his great-grandparents. As Martin stood and looked at the headstone, he felt something pull at his leg so hard that he fell to the ground. Slightly shaken up, he got up and looked around, but the boy had disappeared, and he found himself alone in the graveyard. After he told his family about what had happened, his grandfather spoke up and said he had a similar experience when his mother, Martin's great-grandmother, passed away, but instead of seeing himself as a young boy, he saw his father, who had passed away 6 years earlier. We know lots of viewers have had experiences very similar to this after a relative has passed, and we'd love to hear about them in the comments. Or send us a personal email at mystory@top5s.co.uk. Creepy Polaroid. This first photograph was sent in by Gage. It was taken by his grandmother Rose many years ago, before there was any technology to alter images. When Rose was young, her family took her on a trip to Germany to visit her grandmother, and whilst there, they did some sightseeing at some of the many castles in Germany. Rose had a Polaroid camera and took several photographs that day, but the one that stood out was the one taken in the trophy room of one of the castles. Take a look. Now that really looks like feet, possibly a face, hand and Rose. What it is we have no idea, but Gage believes it's one of the best ghost photos he's ever seen. It's a shame Rose doesn't remember the name of the castle so we could research its history. If any of you recognise that room, we'd love to know where it was so we can look further into it. But what do you think that is in the photo? The Rockwood Cemetery and Necropolis in Sydney, Australia. The Rockwood Necropolis holds the dubious honour of being the largest cemetery in the Southern Hemisphere, housing the mortal remains of over 1 million people. It's difficult to underestimate how large this necropolis, or City of the Dead, is, having an area larger than the actual city of Sydney. Rockwood has seen its fair share of suffering souls and strange occurrences. Some victims from the sinking of the Titanic have their final resting place in this cemetery, and rumours are abound that their drowning sobs can still be heard bouncing off of the tombstones. The infamous murderer, robber and fraudster, who is known as Australia's first gangster, John Chow Hayes, is buried in this necropolis, with some visitors reporting the sounds of gunshots and laughter behind them when near his grave. The broad range and sheer quantity of people buried here makes for nearly an unlimited amount of stories and rumours. It is said that deep in the cemetery one can find devil chairs, on which one can make sacrifice and summon the devil in order to make an exchange with him at the cost of your immortal soul. This massive necropolis is not only one of the world's largest, but it is still in use, and has the potential to keep on generating rumours and reports for the foreseeable future. Have any of you visited here? The Camp Chase Confederate Cemetery in Columbus, Ohio. Camp Chase was an American Civil War training and prison camp established in May 1861. Upwards of 150,000 Union soldiers and 25,000 Confederate prisoners passed through its gates between 1861 and 1865. By the end of the American Civil War, more than 2,200 Confederate prisoners died and were buried in the camp. Their deaths were largely due to the poor conditions in their prison. Lack of hygiene and clean latrines, coupled with chronic food shortages, left the prisoners in terrible suffering. While the training camp was dismantled in the aftermath of the war, the cemetery has remained to this day. This cemetery is known for various average ghost sightings, but one apparition stands out from the rest. Having been reported by various people since the end of the 1800s, she is called the Lady in Grey, and is said to be a young, perhaps in her late teens or early 20s, dressed entirely in grey and carrying a clean white handkerchief. She is known to walk through the cemetery, quietly sweeping and trying to read the names of the gravestones, believed to be in search of a loved lost one to the war. Visitors regularly see her wandering and searching before vanishing from sight. One time in 1988, during a Civil War reenactment that took place nearby, many people reported hearing the mournful weeping of a woman. The sound pierced through the sounds of the reenactment, but stopped after a few minutes, with no source ever being identified. It's no surprise that a war as brutal and historically divisive as the US Civil War would generate lost spirits that still wander heartbroken and lost to this day. Howard Street Cemetery, Salem, Massachusetts. Salem, Massachusetts has a well-earned dark reputation as the place in which one of the United States' most notorious witch trials took place. At the start of these trials, in the spring of 1692, a group of women accused local farmer Giles Corey, and then later his wife Martha, of witchcraft. Corey asserted that he was not guilty, but rejected a trial, correctly believing that the court was biased against him and would never declare him innocent. After his death sentence was passed, Corey was crushed to death over the course of 3 days. During the execution, the entire village watched on as though it was a spectacle. Corey was then buried in a grave in what is now Howard Street Cemetery, near the site of his execution. Since his death, it is rumoured that his spirit haunts the town. According to a local legend, the ghost of Giles Corey is known to appear and wander around the graveyard whenever a disaster is about to strike Salem. Most notably, he was said to have appeared the night before the Great Salem Fire of 1914, which destroyed much of the town. The position of Sheriff of Essex County is also said to suffer from Corey's post-mortem curse, as the holders of that office, including the sheriff who condemned Corey, had either died or resigned as a result of heart or blood ailments. Giles's wife Martha was hanged 3 days after his death, accused in the same way that Giles was. Martha was also buried in the cemetery and is said to lead visitors in circles around the cemetery in an effort to make them disorientated and lose their way. It is said that these two unhappy spirits still appear to this very day, though the curse of the sheriff was thought to be broken in the 1990s when the office was moved to a new location. We'd love to know if any of you have visited Howard Street Cemetery and had any experiences there. The South Park Cemetery in West Bengal, India. One of the largest non-church Christian cemeteries outside of Europe and the Americas is the South Park Cemetery in Kolkata, India, and it's well known for being a spooky and strange place. While no longer in use today, this cemetery remains protected in India as a heritage site. Opened in 1767 and used actively until the 1830s, this 8-acre cemetery is enclosed by a high brick wall, which protects the mix of tombs, monuments and mausoleums. The nearly 1,900 graves are of all sorts of varying styles and designs, ranging from European Gothic and Classical to Indo-Iranian and Indo-Arabic styles, made all the more haunting by the fact many of the graves are marked for people who were in their early 20s and younger. These mixed styles are all jumbled together in a veritable maze of obelisks, cairns, urns, and statuary. Further adding to the spooky atmosphere is the plant life that has slowly been taking over the site. Green mosses and prehistoric ferns cover much of the grounds and work to make the cemetery even spookier than it would have otherwise been. There are a large variety of reports coming from those who have been to the cemetery of strange and otherworldly occurrences. Many people report getting lost and losing time in the cemetery, as well as feeling dizzy and breathless. Some say that they captured strange-looking structures on their cameras. Others still report the sounds of instruments playing, a ghostly lament, for all the premature deaths that found their eternal resting place in this cemetery. One of the creepiest stories is that of the Bleeding Tomb. Deep in the undergrowth of the cemetery, there is a small pyramid-shaped tomb that is rumoured to ooze a blood-like substance during monsoons. The half-forgotten memorial belonged to a family called the Dennison family, all of whom are said to have died within weeks of each other for reasons not recorded. This bleeding tomb, as well as the other creepy features of this historical cemetery, make it one of the world's most haunted, and definitely one of India's most haunted cemeteries. Wadi AlSalam Cemetery in Iraq. For many Shia Muslims across the globe, Wadi AlSalam, or Valley of Peace, in south of Baghdad, is among the highest coveted final resting places, perhaps only behind the shrine of Imam Ali. Being the largest cemetery in the world, it is easy to imagine that this place would be very haunted. Among the 5 million Muslims buried in the graveyard are victims of Iraq's wars, disasters and plagues over the last 14,000 years, and it is said by the very workers who make their living at the cemetery that these souls are not only restless but often hostile. One former gravedigger described an odd creature called Gorilla that the locals believe inhabits the graveyard. He said of the creature, "One day a shadow sneaked up behind me and hit my head violently, leaving me badly injured. I no longer walk straight and feel like the ghost still haunts my body." His family has spent thousands of dollars on various treatments, but he still claims to be weighed down by a dark presence. Another gravedigger reported burying a woman in her tomb, only to turn around and feel her hand slap him harshly across the face, leaving him petrified. There is a high rate of turnover of undertakers and groundskeepers at the cemetery, who regularly face mental health issues, such as depression, mania, and suicidal ideation, after working at the cemetery. With this cemetery seeing as many as 200 burials a day during the peak of the American-Iraq War, with those numbers skyrocketing to anywhere between 300 and 600 burials a day. This cemetery is saturated with suffering and fear. A gravesite with this much history and tragedy behind it, stretching even as far back as the close of Sassanid rule of the area, is bound to be full of restless and haunted spirits. If any of you have ever visited and have your own stories to tell, please let us know in the comments section. Tom and Eileen, lone again. In January 1998, husband and wife Tom and Eileen were returning from a Peace Corps mission in Fiji, heading home to Hawaii. Both were experienced divers and decided they couldn't pass up the chance of diving at the Great Barrier Reef. So on January 25th, they boarded the Outer Edge boat that took them and a group of other tourists 40 miles out to sea, where they visited 3 dive sites, the last being a place named Fish City. The pair were experienced divers and were comfortable going off on their own in the water. However, when they resurfaced from their dive, to their horror, their dive boat had departed without them, leaving them all alone, bobbing in the vast ocean. It is standard practice for dive excursions to do a head count before heading back to shore, but on this occasion, something went drastically wrong. None of the vessel's crew or passengers noticed the two had not come back aboard, until 2 days later, when the boat owner looked in a bag that had been left behind that day by a passenger. Immediately, alarm bells started to ring when he discovered Tom's wallet. A rescue team was immediately sent out and extensive searches were made, but sadly the couple were never seen again, their bodies assumed to be lost at sea. Like other nightmarish experiences, Tom and Eileen's story was turned into a film called Open Water that depicted the couple meeting their end, circled by sharks. But the true story is much scarier, simply because no one really knows what happened to them. Over the years, a lot of information has come out about their lives and the circumstances that led to them being abandoned. Several weeks after they were reported missing, pieces of their diving gear washed up on shore, including inflatable jackets with their names on, air tanks, and a woman's wetsuit. However, none of the items had any signs of blood or holes that would be consistent with a shark attack. What was strange was why the Lonegans had removed the jacket that would help to keep them afloat. It's theorized they may have taken them off in an attempt to swim to shore, although without the buoyancy of their jackets, they would have likely worn themselves out to the point of exhaustion. One of the most chilling things was discovered 6 months after they disappeared, when a dive slate was discovered by a fisherman. A dive slate is used by divers so they can communicate underwater. They are basically small boards where information and messages can be written. The dive slate found by the fisherman was dated January 26, 1998, with a time of 8 AM and a message that read, "Please help us or we will die." The distress note appears to indicate the loner gangs were still alive at least until the next day. Also discovered at the couple's home were diaries that both Tom and Eileen had kept, and some of the entries indicated all was not well in their lives. They wrote about hating their jobs, and eerily, Eileen felt her husband had developed a death wish. Tom's diary appeared to back this up, with an entry that read, "Like a student who has finished an exam, I feel that my life is complete and I am ready to die." These revelations led to suggestions. The couple were either carrying out a suicide pact or were the victims of a murder-suicide at the hands of Tom. Another strange theory emerged while police were investigating the case. The captain of another boat claimed to have visited the same dive spot the next day and may have encountered the couple. According to his story, the head count before the vessel's return trip came out 2 more than the one taken when the boat left port. Apparently the tourists on the boat were all from Italy and spoke in their native tongue. However, the captain remembers hearing a few American voices among the tourists that day. If this account is true, it could indicate the Lonegans planned to spend the night in the ocean, knowing they could join another dive boat the next day. leading to claims the loner gangs faked their own death. This theory was later reinforced when more than 20 people came forward claiming to have seen the loner gangs after they supposedly disappeared. However, considering they both left their passports behind, never touched their bank accounts after the incident, and their insurance policies were never cashed in, this does seem a bit far-fetched. Some have questioned why the loner gangs didn't swim to one of the well-lit diving platforms a few miles away or flag down a passing ship, although it's been pointed out that although these things would be easily visible from the deck of a boat, they may not have been easily seen from the surface of the water. Tom had also left his glasses on board, making it even more difficult for him to see. In addition, it's highly likely the loner gangs were in a state of panic. They had been left completely alone, and as hours ticked by, they must have realised their boat wasn't returning for them, and there was no active rescue underway. Couple this with the heat from the sun and lack of fresh drinking water, they were likely in a bad way. No one knows what happened to the loner gangs, and it's hard to imagine being in that situation, totally alone surrounded by a shark-infested ocean. It seems unlikely that they were eaten by sharks, as though half of the world's sharks live in the waters around Australia, most of them are completely harmless to humans. All the evidence seems to point to the loner gangs becoming exhausted and drowning. Clearly mistakes were made by the boat owner, and after he was acquitted of manslaughter, a civil case was brought against him and the business closed. Stricter laws on how dive companies operate and how head counts are taken have also been enforced. It's horrific to think they likely lived for at least 48 hours alone in the ocean. The case is sad because unless they intentionally faked their own death, which seems unlikely, this shouldn't have happened. Ron and Dan Lafferty. Ron and Dan Lafferty were raised in a large dysfunctional family in Orem, Utah. Ron was the eldest of 8 children that consisted of 6 boys and 2 girls. They were all brought up in a strict Mormon family, and their father was a stern disciplinarian who sometimes took out his rage on the family. On one occasion, he beat the family dog to death with a baseball bat. As well as being a disciplinarian, he was also a conspiracy theorist who taught his children to distrust conventional medicine and the federal government. As Ron and Dan grew up, they became very close and both carried their father's extreme beliefs into adulthood. Dan in particular thought he was well above the law and was often in trouble for refusing to pay taxes or obey traffic laws. Both men married and continued to be active members of the church. However, eventually, Dan became disgruntled with the Mormon church when it abandoned polygamy, the practice of taking more than one wife, and he joined a splinter group called the School of the Prophets. Ron soon followed his younger brother into the movement after being excommunicated from the Mormon church in 1983. The School of the Prophets taught how to receive relations from God, and soon all 6 Lafferty brothers joined the movement, and all of them were spending a lot of time together, railing against the Mormon church and the US government, much to the annoyance of their wives. Dan and Ron also declared to the group that they were prophets, and both men started sporting an unkempt appearance with long beards. Eventually, Ron's wife left him. She objected to his bizarre and twisted views and refused to practice polygamy. Ron was bereft and deeply depressed after she left, and spent his days and nights writing what he believed would one day be a scripture. But his anguish at the breakup of his marriage soon turned into rage, and he blamed 3 people: Chloe Lowe, a former Mormon Relief Society president who had supported his wife during the divorce; Richard Stowe, the Highland Mormon stake president who had presided over his excommunication; and Brenda Wright Lafferty, the strong-willed wife of his youngest brother Alan. Brenda was a former beauty queen and a college graduate. She was confident and not afraid to speak up. She didn't believe Ron or Dan were prophets, and she told them as much. She also objected to their fundamentalist belief in polygamy, and when Alan started to be influenced by Dan and Ron's beliefs, she fought back and stopped him attending the meetings. Ron's anger towards Brenda grew in his mind. She had driven away his wife, and now she was splitting up the brothers. He later claimed he had a revelation that God told him that Brenda needed to be removed, along with her infant daughter. Ron shared his revelation with the School of Prophets members on what he called the removal revelation list. Chloe Lowe and Richard Stowe were also on it. This is what he wrote. Thus saith the Lord unto my servants the prophets, it is my will and commandment that ye remove the following individuals, in order that my work might go forward. For they have truly become obstacles in my path, and I will not allow my work to be stopped. First thy brother's wife Brenda and her baby, then Chloe Lowe, and then Richard Stowe. And it is my will that they be removed in rapid succession. On the afternoon of July 24th, 1984, Ron and his brother Dan set out to fulfill the revelation. Driving a battered green station wagon, they drove to Alan and Brenda's home in American Fork, Utah. Carrying with them guns and knives, the two bearded men entered the house, where they beat and strangled Brenda with a vacuum cleaner cord, before slashing her and baby Erica's throat with a knife. Both men were soon arrested for the crime. In court, Dan represented himself and was found guilty and sentenced to 5 years to life. After psychiatric evaluation, Ron was found to be fit to stand trial and was also tried and convicted in 1985. He was sentenced to death. After years of unsuccessful appealing on grounds of mental capability, Ron elected to be executed by firing squad. However, in 2019, Ron died in Salt Lake City State Prison, aged 78. Had he lived, he was due to be executed the following year. His brother Dan still languishes in the maximum security wing of Utah State Prison, and over the years has spoken in graphic detail about what he did to his sister-in-law and baby niece. A book called Under the Banner of Heaven, A Story of Violent Faith, was written about the brothers based on interviews Dan gave. Dan remains to this day unrepentant, still believing all organized religion is of the devil. He doesn't believe he will die in prison. He believes the walls will crumble and he will emerge as the biblical prophet Elijah, announcing the second coming of Christ. The Dnepropetrovsk Maniacs. This case was suggested by one of our patrons. It was committed in Ukraine by 3 friends who went on a 3-week killing spree, during which they killed over 20 innocent people. Viktor Sayenko, Igor Soprunyuk, and Alexander Hanza were all born in 1988 to wealthy, influential parents and attended school together in Dnepropetrovsk, Ukraine. They all suffered from various phobias, which they tried to overcome by doing strange activities, such as hanging over the railing of balconies to combat their fear of height, and torturing and killing stray dogs and cats to cure a fear of blood. After leaving school, Sayenko and Hanza got jobs, while Soprunyuk became an unlicensed taxi driver. To make extra money, the 3 teenagers started robbing taxi passengers. However, eventually Sayenko and Soprunyuk lost interest in robbing and decided to move on to murders. In a 3-week killing spree between June and July 2007, they randomly selected victims who happened to be out walking. After creeping up on their victims, they mercilessly bludgeoned them to death with blunt instruments, such as hammers and steel bars. They often killed more than 1 person in a day, beating them so badly that they would be almost unrecognizable. Some of the victims were also tortured and mutilated. They then recorded and photographed their dead victims, posing with them as if they had been out hunting. They were eventually caught after a survivor, 14-year-old Vadmin Lyakov, ran to the police after his friend was murdered by the pair. Initially, Vadmin was blamed for the killing. However, it quickly became clear that he was not responsible, and his sketches of the perpetrators helped to identify them. The 3 19-year-olds were charged with involvement in 29 separate incidents, including 21 murders, and 8 more attacks where victims survived. Soprunyuk was charged with 27 of the cases, including 21 counts of capital murder, 8 armed robberies, and 1 count of animal cruelty. Sayenko was also charged with 25 instances, including 18 murders, 5 robberies, and 1 count of animal cruelty, and Hanza was charged with 2 counts of armed robbery, as he never participated in any of the murders. Soprunyuk and Sayenko were both sentenced to life imprisonment, while Hanza was sentenced to 9 years. No motive has ever been established, although local media reported the killers had a plan to get rich from showing the murders on the internet. In April 2019, it was reported that Alexander Hanza had been released from prison after serving 9 years and is now married and living with his wife and 2 children somewhere in Ukraine. The devastating story of John Edward Jones. At age 26, John Edward Jones was in the prime of his life. He was married, he had a 1-year-old daughter, and was attending medical school in Virginia. In November 2009, John had travelled back to his hometown in Utah to spend with his friends and family. John and his brother Josh had been keen cavers as kids, along with 9 other friends and family members, and decided to explore Nutty Putty Cave, a notoriously tricky hydrothermal cave formation located just west of Utah Lake. The group set off on the evening of November the 24th. About an hour into the expedition, John decided to find the Nutty Putty Cave formation known as the Birth Canal, a very tight passage that experienced splunkers needed to carefully crawl through. It had been years since John had been in a cave, and at 6 feet tall and 200 pounds, he wasn't the little kid who used to easily crawl into caves with his father. Despite this, John pushed on, entering the narrow opening head first, carefully shuffling along using his hips, stomach and fingers. However, it soon became apparent he was stuck. He had squeezed in so tightly he had no room to turn around and no room to back out. He tried to push on, but just made things worse. He was stuck in a space that was barely 10 inches across and 18 inches high. Josh was the first to find John and tried to pull his brother out by grabbing his legs. However, this made things worse, as John slid down into the passage even further, and his arms were now pinned underneath his chest and he couldn't move at all. All the brothers, who were devout Mormons, could do at this point was pray. Josh called for help, but because John was trapped 400 feet into the cave and 100 feet below the surface, getting rescuers' equipment and supplies down that far took over an hour. The first rescuer to reach John was a woman named Susie Motola, who arrived just after midnight on November 25th. By this time, John had been stuck for 3.5 hours. All Susie could see was a pair of navy and black running shoes. Time was running out for John. The downward angle at which he was trapped was putting huge stress on his body, and his blood was struggling to pump around, and he was having some difficulty breathing. At one point, rescuers brought a 2-way cable radio into the cave and managed to lower it to John so he could speak with his wife. They were both understandably upset, but able to comfort each other. Over the next 24 hours, more than 100 rescue workers tried to free John, but after everything failed to budge him, they decided to use a system of pulleys and ropes. They tied John to a rope connected to a series of pulleys. When everything was in place, they pulled as hard as they could, working in an 8-man tandem. John was at times in great pain, but slowly but surely he started to move, until he was finally high enough to make eye contact with one of the rescuers. They even managed a short conversation. John was almost out. Then suddenly, without warning, one of the pulleys failed after coming loose from its anchor point in the cave wall. The entire team fell backwards as the rope suddenly went loose. Once the dust had settled, the rescuers realized John had slid right down the crevice again, this time seemingly even deeper than before. There was now no hope of rescue, and John's heart could take no more after hours of strain due to his downward position. Sadly, John was pronounced dead of cardiac arrest shortly before midnight on the evening of November 25th, 2009. Rescuers had heroically spent 27 hours trying to save him. His family thanked them for their help, even despite the tragic news. After John's death, officials sealed off Nutty Putty Cave for good. They never recovered his body, which remains inside to this day. John's family had a plaque put on the entrance of the cave in his memory, and Nutty Putty Cave now serves as a national memorial and gravesite to John Edward Jones. In 2016, filmmaker Isaac Halasima produced and directed a full-length feature film about the life and failed rescue of John Jones, called The Last Descent. It gives an accurate and terrifying insight into the ordeal John suffered. Anatoly Moskvin. Anatoly Moskvin was a smart guy. He spoke 13 languages, travelled extensively, and was a published scholar and college lecturer. He also had a dubious reputation as being an expert on cemeteries, as he knew everything there was to know about the cemeteries in his city, Nizhny Novgorod, Russia. Moskvin claimed that between 2005 and 2007, he visited 752 cemeteries and delved into the histories of those buried there. He attributed his obsession with the macabre to a 1979 incident when he was 13 and a group of men in black suits stopped him on the way home from school. They were en route to the funeral of 11-year-old Natasha Petrova and allegedly dragged young Moskvin to her coffin where they forced him to kiss the girl's corpse. Moskvin even claimed he spent one night sleeping in a coffin ahead of a deceased person's funeral to add to his observations. However, it seems at one point, this obsession with death spilled over. In 2009, locals began to discover the graves of their loved ones desecrated or completely dug up. Initially, authorities thought it was done by some extremist organizations, so they increased police units in the affected areas. But after nearly 2 years, they found nothing, and graves continued to be desecrated. They then got a break following a terrorist attack at a Moscow airport in 2011. Shortly afterwards, Muslim graves in the area started being vandalized. Someone was painting over the pictures of dead Muslims. Further investigations led them to Moskvin, who was caught red-handed at the graves. Police later searched his home, a small apartment he shared with his parents, and what they found was shocking. The apartment was full of life-sized, doll-like figures. The figures resembled antique dolls. They were dressed in fine clothing, and some wore knee-high boots and had makeup on their cloth-covered faces. Except these were not dolls, they were mummified corpses of human girls. Take a look at this footage, but be warned, it is disturbing. Inside the chests of many of the dolls, Moskvin had weirdly embedded music boxes, so when he lifted them up they played music. Investigators also found photographs and plaques taken from gravestones, as well as doll-making manuals and maps of local cemeteries. There were also personal belongings and clothing inside some of the mummies, and one had a piece of her own gravestone with her name scrawled on it inside her body. Another one contained a hospital tag with the date and the cause of her death, and a dried human heart was found inside a third body. Moskvin later admitted that he would stuff the decaying corpses with rags and wrap their hands in nylon tights and draw faces on them. He would also insert buttons or fake eyes into the girls' eye sockets so that they could watch cartoons with him. He told police that he dug up graves of girls because he was lonely and wanted children of his own. After taking them home, he used a simple solution of salt and baking soda to preserve the corpses. He treated them as if they were his daughters by singing to them and celebrating their birthdays. Moskvin also said he was waiting for science to find a way to bring the girls back to life. He always denied any sexual attraction to the dolls. In all, authorities discovered 29 life-size dolls in his apartment. They ranged in age from 3 to 25, and one corpse had been kept for nearly 9 years. Remarkably, his parents claimed to know nothing of the true origin of the dolls living in their home, believing it was just a hobby of their sons. Moskvin was charged with a dozen crimes, all of which dealt with the desecration of graves. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and sentenced to time in a psychiatric hospital. Chillingly, Moskvin allegedly told authorities not to bother reburying the girls too deeply, as he will simply unbury them when he is released. Gibraltar Point Lighthouse, Canada. The Gibraltar Point Lighthouse is located on Toronto Island, an island located in Lake Ontario in Canada. Although it was authorized in 1803, it wasn't until 1808 that construction began, and the lighthouse was completed 1 year later in 1809. It's the oldest existing lighthouse on the Great Lakes, and one of Toronto's oldest buildings. But age aside, most notably, the Gibraltar Point Lighthouse is best known for the death of its very first keeper. whose murder forms the basis of Toronto's most famous ghost story, and is something out of a murder mystery story, complete with an unsolved murder and many paranormal sightings. It all begins with German-born John Rudermüller, the first keeper of the Gibraltar Point Lighthouse, who was found murdered in 1815. According to the local legend, soldiers from Fort York paid the keeper a visit on the evening of January 2nd in search of his bootlegged beer. But the occasion was not the merry one that you might expect. Instead, the soldiers, who had had too much to drink at this point, got into an argument with John, which resulted in his murder. The story goes that the soldiers attempted to conceal the crime by dismembering the keeper's body and hiding the remains in various locations. Fast forward 80 years to 1893, and another keeper named George Durham, who was familiar with the story, decided to look for evidence of John's murder. More specifically, he wanted to find his body. Upon searching for it, he stumbled across a part of a jawbone and pieces of a coffin just outside the lighthouse walls. Unfortunately, it was impossible to connect these items with John, given the lack of forensic techniques at the time. This was the late 1800s, don't forget. In another version of the story, the soldiers thought that John was trying to rip them off because they saw the beer freeze one cold night and assumed the alcohol content was low enough for the beer to freeze. A more recent exploration of the case uncovered that John was a real man. He had been born in 1763 in Ansbach, Germany, where he worked as a royal servant for 20 years in the households of the Duke of Gloucester and the Duke of Kent. He became the Gibraltar Point lighthouse keeper in 1809. It was also found that indeed John had suffered a violent death on January 2nd, 1815, being just 52 years old at the time. 2 soldiers were charged with his murder, but were ultimately acquitted. The soldiers were Irishmen of the Glengarry Light Infantry named John Henry and John Blumen. Modern evidence suggests that the keeper's body was not mutilated, but it's unclear if his body was ever recovered. Nanjing, China. The city of Nanjing in China is the site of one of the most gruesome and bloody invasions from the Second Sino-Japanese War. Those familiar with World War II will be all too familiar with this horrific event, but for those who do not, viewer discretion is advised. For a period of 6 weeks, starting on December 13th of 1937, mass murder and rape was carried out by Imperial Japanese troops against the residents of Nanjing, which was then the capital of China, during a war between the Republic of China and the Empire of Japan. That December 13th, Japan captured Nanjing and subjected its residents to true horror. At one time before the war, Nanjing was once one of China's most prosperous cities and industrial centers. In the aftermath of what is now known as the Nanjing Massacre, or the Nanking Massacre, it was abandoned as the country's capital and took decades to recover from the atrocities, many of which we cannot speak of in a video. Following their victory in Shanghai in 1937, Japanese troops turned their attention to Nanjing. Chinese troops were ordered to leave the city by the government, leaving it defended only by untrained and inexperienced auxiliary troops. The citizens were forbidden from leaving the city, although some did so anyway. Unfortunately, many stayed behind. A safety zone was created by Western businessmen and missionaries in November that year, which was the size equivalent of New York's Central Park. Then, a month later, in December, the Chinese government abandoned Nanjing. The remaining citizens who hadn't fled were ordered into the safety zone. As Japanese soldiers made their way to Nanjing, there were countless whispers about the atrocities committed by the troops, including stories that they held killing contests. Neither children nor the elderly were exempt from the cruelty of the Japanese military, and upon entering Nanjing, they looted and burned 1/3 of the buildings. Entire families were massacred, and thousands were left dead in mass graves. Oil was thrown onto the bodies before they were set alight, and they reportedly went door to door in search of victims. Beheadings and firing squad deaths were extremely popular methods of execution among the Japanese troops. Although Japan initially agreed that they would respect the safety zone, in January of 1938 they dismantled the zone completely. The massacre of Nanjing citizens carried on until the first week of February. Historians are unable to determine the death toll, as most Japanese military records on the killings were kept secret or were destroyed after the surrender at the end of World War II. Regardless, it's believed that between 200,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians were murdered, and between 20,000 and 80,000 girls and women were sexually assaulted. Lancaster Castle, England. Lancaster Castle, also known as John o' Gaunt's Castle, is the oldest standing building in Lancaster, England. As a result, it has a very colourful history. Early history on the castle is unclear, but it's generally agreed that the castle was founded around the 11th century, where it was mostly used as a prison. After the 1800s, executions at the castle began to take place at the Hanging Corner, an area in between the tower and the wall on the east side of the terrace steps. Today, the ground floor of the tower is on the drop room, which contains relics from the executions. Out of the 200 hangings which occurred at the castle, only 43 of them were for murder. Other hanging offences at the time included burglary, passing forged notes, and cattle stealing. Most of the people who were executed at Lancaster Castle were found guilty of one of these more minor offences. 131 of these hangings were carried out by one hangman named Ned Barlow. The last public execution was on March 25th of 1865, when Stephen Burke was hanged for the murder of his wife. The case of the Pendle Witches is probably one of the most famous in Lancaster Castle's history. The Pendle Witches, which consisted of two families headed by widowed elderly women, lived during the reigns of Elizabeth I and James I, so around 1558 to 1625. As we explored in our History of Witches and Witchcraft documentary, the era of James I was an unpleasant one for anyone who either was a witch or was accused of witchcraft. When he came into power, he brought with him a disdain for the craft and changes in the law which made it so that various forms of witchcraft practice could be punished by death. 3 generations of one family were accused of witchcraft, and so the Pendle Witches stood trial at Lancaster Castle. Elizabeth Southern, the elderly widow of one of the 2 families, died in prison while awaiting trial. She was 80 years old. The trial occurred in August of 1612, and the prisoners were not allowed to have a defence counsel, nor could they call any witnesses to speak on their behalf. In addition to the 10 family members, the 7 members of the so-called Samlesbury Witches were also tried, along with 2 other women. The witnesses for the prosecution gave shaky and inconsistent evidence against the Pendle Witches. Their information was largely based on rumours, idle gossip, and false confessions. Oddly enough, the prosecution's chief witness was the granddaughter of Elizabeth Southern. After just 3 days, 10 family members were found guilty of witchcraft and sentenced to death. Security Prison 21 in Cambodia. A former secondary school in Phnom Penh was the site of torture, murder, and unbridled cruelty in the mid to late 1970s, when the Khmer Rouge regime was in power in Cambodia. In 1976, the regime established the state of Democratic Kampuchea. The party's aim was to establish a classless, communist state and reject the free market and capitalism. Between 1976 and 1979, 20,000 people were imprisoned at a former secondary school, which was used as Security Prison 21 by the regime. It was just one of around 150 and 196 torture and execution centres established by the regime. The true number of prisoners is unknown, and it's estimated that 12,000 people were killed in the prison. Iron bars and barbed wire were placed across the building's windows to prevent both escapes and suicides. Classrooms were converted into tiny prison and torture chambers, and electrified barbed wire was set up to surround the building. At any one time, 1,000 to 1,500 prisoners were held in the building, where they were repeatedly tortured and coerced into naming family members and associates, who in turn were arrested, tortured, and killed. Most prisoners were held for between 2 and 3 months. Upon arriving at the jail, prisoners were photographed and required to give a detailed autobiography. They were then forced to strip down to their underwear, and their possessions were confiscated. Often they were shackled to floors or walls, or in large mass cells, where they would be shackled to long pieces of iron bar. They slept on the floor without mats, mosquito nets, or blankets, and were forbidden to speak to one another. The prisoners' day started at around 4:30 a.m. with strip searches. They were fed 4 spoonfuls of porridge and a watery soup of leaves twice a day. Drinking water or doing anything without the permission of the guards resulted in serious beatings. Victims were also sometimes forced to eat human waste and drink urine. These unhygienic conditions in which the prisoners lived led to a whole host of health conditions, including ringworm and rashes. Medical staff at the jail were untrained and offered treatment only to sustain prisoners' lives after being injured during interrogation. But when it comes to the torture methods, it was pretty brutal. Electric shocks, heated tools, waterboarding, and the pulling out of fingernails were all used as methods of torture in the prison. Sexual abuse also occurred, despite the fact that it was against the regime's policy. It's long been believed that the vast majority of victims were innocent. The confessions given by prisoners often included fabricated stories about their involvement in espionage activities for the likes of the CIA, KGB, which never amounted to anything. By 1976, just 1 year after the prison's opening, there was no more space to bury bodies. As a result, prisoners were taken to Crow's Feet Pond, where they were killed by teenagers and buried in graves that held as few as 6 bodies and as many as 100. This area came to be known as one of many killing fields. Harbin, China. The name Unit 731 probably doesn't mean much to any of you watching, unless you're very familiar with military history, but it was in fact the home of much cruelty and depravity between 1937 and 1945. Unit 731 was a covert biological and chemical warfare research development unit of the Imperial Japanese Army, which was set up in the Pingfang district of the city of Harbin, in northeast of China. Officially, it was called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwangtung Army and was set up in 1937. 3,000 workers at the unit were led by Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii. Unit 731 used thousands of Chinese civilians and wartime prisoners as guinea pigs to breed and develop killer diseases. This place is the stuff of nightmares. Human subjects were infected with the plague and anthrax, before being vivisected without anesthesia to see how these diseases affected the body. Victims were also tied to stakes so that biological weapons like bombs filled with plague-infested fleas could be tested, and limbs were removed and reattached to different areas of the body. The same thing also occurred with organs. But the atrocities did not stop there, not by a long shot. Weapons such as flamethrowers were tested on humans, Some victims were deprived of food and water to determine the length of time until death. Others were placed into low-pressure chambers until their eyes popped from their sockets. Some were even injected with animal blood and seawater. Sexual acts were forced between prisoners, usually between a victim who was infected with an STI and one who was not, to study how the diseases were transmitted. At least 11 Chinese cities were attacked with biological agents, one of which was an attack on Changde in 1941, which led to 10,000 biological casualties and 1,700 deaths among unprepared Japanese soldiers. Before Japan's surrender at the end of World War II, the experiment sites were destroyed along with any evidence, and the remaining 400 prisoners were shot. Mice left over from experiments which were infected with the bubonic plague were released. It's believed that this move resulted in the deaths of thousands of civilians, but has been impossible to track. For 40 years, Unit 731's activities were a closely guarded secret of World War II. It wasn't until the 1990s that Japanese officials acknowledged the unit's existence, but even then, they did not disclose details. Those emerged only as a result of testimony from former members, photographs, and documentary evidence. Only a handful of those involved in the unit were prosecuted for war crimes in China, while none were prosecuted in Japan. At the end of World War II, America granted members of the unit with immunity in exchange for details of their experiments. Lieutenant General Ishii lived on the outskirts of Tokyo until he died in 1959. Many leaders of the experiments gained high-ranking positions in medical schools and health research centers. And in recent years, the National Archives of Japan disclosed the names of 3,600 members of the unit in an attempt to encourage historians to continue their research into the unit and all of its atrocities. Diva. In the Western world, divas are a lesser-known kind of supernatural creature. They are said to be extremely powerful demons and are more often than not male entities. They stem from Zoroastrianism, the oldest religious community in Iran, and are mentioned in their oldest religious text, Gathas, and their newest religious text, Avesta. Divas are thought to personify disease, sin, distress, and suffering, and are portrayed as being false gods, or gods that are to be rejected. They are also powers of nature. In Avesta, they are mentioned as being entities designed to create chaos and disorder. Divas were apparently birthed from the evil thoughts of Ahriman, the main adversary in Zoroastrianism, for the purpose of waging war against goodness and humanity. They are said to do his bidding and help him in his evil plans, in the same way that the Christian devil is frequently portrayed on TV and in film as having minions. Their goal is to fight all that is good. In early religious texts, the divas spoke as a group rather than individuals, and were not mentioned by individual names, although this changed in later texts. During these early narratives, divas is not seen as an entirely unsalvageable creature, full of hate and darkness, but again, this changes with time. In the newer texts, divas are not only named, but each has traits and characteristics. For example, Akamana is the spirit of evil, Suru is an arcanist and tyrant, and Eshma is the demon of lust and rage. They are described as being devoid of goodness and are reportedly incredibly hostile, spending their time lurking around and waiting to attack the vulnerable. However, it's worth noting that the divas is also the name given to some evil men, and that divas can take on a human form. They are attracted to unclean places and often spend their time in grim locations where corpses are exposed. They are often portrayed as being unable to establish truth from falsehood, which led them down the wrong religious path. Duppies. Duppies are another lesser-known entity in the Western world. The word duppy is of African origin and is commonly used in the Caribbean islands, including Barbados and Jamaica, to refer to malevolent spirits. Much of the Caribbean folklore revolves around them. Duppies are the equivalent of European shapeshifters and tricksters, and the name is sometimes spelled as Duffy. Duppies are said to come out at night, after 7 PM and before 5 AM, often haunting people or wandering around looking for their next victim. They hide in bamboo thickets and cottonwood groves, with many of them feeding on bamboo. They are known for committing heinous and violent crimes such as arson, beating, burning and poisoning, and come in all sorts of variations, some of which we'll be taking a look at. You have the rolling calf, which in this instance, the word rolling is used as in roaming, is said to be one of the most terrifying duppies which walks the streets at night. A shapeshifter, the rolling calf frequently chooses to appear as a hornless goat, either white or spotted, with glowing red eyes and flames coming from its nostrils. It reportedly has 2 goat legs for hind legs, but at the front has 1 human leg and 1 horse leg. Around its neck, a collar is said to hang, which has chains attached, which drag along the ground, rattling eerily. Although it's often said to appear as a goat, the rolling calf can also appear as a cat, dog, pig, bull or horse. It's also said that only the soul of an especially wicked person, like a murderer, can become one. Another famous duppy is the 3-footed horse, whose breath is poisonous. It's said to be able to outrun anything, but can't attack those in the shadow of trees. When alive, the monster reportedly pulled hearses. It is most active between 1 and 4 in the morning, where it wanders the highway searching for a victim. Another way to avoid the 3-footed horse is to either climb a tree or duck underneath a fence. However, one must duck under it, as if one chooses to climb it, the creature will simply jump the fence and give chase. The 3-footed horse is said to be ridden by the whooping boy, a boy with long hair and red eyes. He too has poisonous breath, which he can use to claim the lives of his victims. It's said he only emerges at night, where he carries a whip, and is named to the wild, whooping cries he makes. The third and final notorious duppy we'll be discussing is the old hag, who appears to be an old reclusive woman by day, but is also a shapeshifter. At night she transforms into her true form as a fireball and flies across the sky at night, searching for a sufferer. Old hag can enter the home of her chosen victim via cracks and keyholes. She reportedly sucks blood from her victim's limbs, leaving them black and blue. If she drains too much blood, the sufferer may die, or they may become a monster themselves, leaving their skin empty for their killer to take over. They are known to practice black magic, and in some variations of the story, are keen on kidnapping infants. Changelings. Changelings, sometimes called oafs, are human-like fairy children who are supposedly left in place of a human infant. There are various different stories about changelings, as they are well known across Europe and different countries have their own theories about the motives of fairies. Back in the medieval times, changelings were often used as a reason as to why a child may suddenly fall victim to illness, disorder, or developmental issues. They were also a big reason as to why child abuse and neglect was so abundant at the time. Abnormal children were often abandoned or their lives were taken away. According to Irish legend, changelings often appear sickly and will not grow like a normal child. They may also have strange features like a beard or long teeth, and may appear more intelligent than a child their age is expected to be. They are also known to display odd behaviours when alone, such as playing an instrument, dancing, or jumping about. One belief as to why fairies swapped their children with human ones is that fairy parents thought it was more respectable to be raised by humans, and thus wanted their children to have a human upbringing. It's also been said that human milk is necessary for the survival of fairy children. In some instances, a mother would be brought back to the fairy realm to feed the children, while in others, the fairies were simply swapped with human infants, so that they could be fed. Human midwives are also thought to be necessary to the birth of fairy children. Upon growing up, some changelings are believed to forget who they really are, and so they go on to live a regular human life. Others remember and return to their fairy relatives, leaving their human family without any warning. However, the changelings legend does have a darker side to it. It's been suggested that fairies take human infants to be given to the devil, or they were captured so they could be servants. In one of the most notable real-life changelings-related cases, 26-year-old Bridget Cleary from Ireland was slain by her husband for apparently being a changeling. In March of 1895, Bridget was diagnosed with bronchitis and was seen by a doctor who gave her a poor prognosis. The young woman was said to have been interested in fairies and got ill after visiting a local spot that was known to be filled with them. As a result, her husband, 35-year-old Michael, and her father, who lived with the couple, accused Bridget of being a fairy. On March 16th, rumours swirled that the 26-year-old was missing. Michael claimed she'd been taken by fairies, while police searched for his missing wife. Her body was located on March 22nd. It was badly burned and had been buried in a shallow grave. It's believed that the couple's neighbour, 55-year-old Jack Doone, put the idea of Bridget being a changeling into Michael's head. Doone was well versed in fairy mythology and, according to Michael, had made the suggestion. Before her demise, Bridget had at one point been pinned down and force-fed a concoction of herbs and milk, designed by a fairy doctor. When she refused to take it, urine was thrown on her. She was also later pinned down by her husband a second time and force-fed bread and jam. On this occasion, Michael struck Bridget's head on the floor and lit her on fire before throwing kerosene on her. Although her family told him to stop, she was already ablaze. Reportedly, Michael threatened to kill Bridget's cousin if he didn't help him dispose of the body. In total, 8 people were arrested and charged with Bridget's demise, including Jack Doone, Michael, and the cousin who was threatened. However, they were all charged with manslaughter instead of murder. The judge believed that they had all acted out of a genuine belief. Pontianak. The Pontianak stems from Indonesian folklore and is one of the most notorious and creepy forms of supernatural beings. The story of the Pontianak finds its origins in the ancient Malay mythology and is essentially the horrifying ghost of a woman who was pregnant when she died. The Pontianak is known to roam around in swamps and forests and favours banana trees. It is for this reason that these areas are often seen by locals of the area as eerie. According to legend, the first Sultan of the Pontianak Sultanate claimed to be haunted by a vengeful Pontianak. The Sultanate was built on swamps along the west coast of Kalimantan, despite the fact that locals advised the Sultan not to do such a thing. As he didn't share their beliefs, the Sultan ignored what they said and ended up falling victim to the Pontianak. This ultimately led to the naming of the city. The Pontianak is described as being a woman dressed in white with long dark hair, who leaves the scent of frangipani flowers behind her. She is known to be able to transform into a beautiful woman who uses her attractiveness to seduce men. Although it's unknown why exactly she carries the vendetta, there are several versions of the story online. In one version, the Pontianak met a violent end at the hands of a man, and she is seeking revenge because she was unable to birth her child. In another version, she is believed to have been sexually assaulted by her landlord, and upon becoming pregnant was buried alive by angry villagers. In her demonic form, the Pontianak has long, sharp nails and consumes male organs. She allegedly steals unborn babies from the bellies of their mothers, or steals them from their cribs, so that she can finally raise a child of her own. Sharp objects can be used to ward her off. Reportedly, she is trapped in the intermediate realm because she is confused and unable to understand or accept her demise. A mystic, or dukun, can be used to help prevent the spirit of a deceased woman from being trapped so that she does not become a Pontianak. Over the last several decades, there have been several film franchises in Indonesia and Malaysia based on Pontianak. Somehow, knowing that these are based on such a dark story from ancient Indonesian folklore makes them seem all the more terrifying. In December 2020, a supposed Pontianak was caught on CCTV hitchhiking a ride on a motorcycle at 2 a.m. in Indonesia. The motorcycle was driving over a bridge known as the Blue Bridge, which according to the locals has a spooky reputation. Take a look. the poltergeist. No video on supernatural beings would be complete without mentioning one that we are all familiar with, the poltergeist, probably one of the most famous known supernatural entities around. It's often shown as the antagonist in horror films, but with good reason. Of all the hauntings a person can go through, the poltergeist is said to be the most dangerous, lashing out unpredictably. They will often start off with small prank-like activities, such as hiding one's keys or phone, but it soon escalates and intensifies. Poltergeists are supposedly responsible for all sorts of physical disturbances, including loud noises, moving objects, and pinching humans and tripping them up. They are also capable of movement, levitating objects, knocking on doors or slamming them. Unlike a lot of other spiritual entities, poltergeists are believed to attach themselves to one person rather than a place. While their endeavours have been recorded since as early as the 1st century, they became more commonly discussed and witnessed in the 1600s. Back in the Middle Ages, they were believed to be demons plaguing the war. While some believe the odd disturbances are the work of a supernatural being, some parapsychologists claim that the intrusions are the work of meddlesome and malicious spirits orchestrated by spiritualists. The spontaneous, recurring psychokinesis theory has also been proposed. This theory states that the weird and unusual activity is the work of all the built-up emotions from stressed and distraught individuals. As a result of their overwhelming emotions, they unconsciously project energy which affects the physical environment. Poltergeists reportedly tend to favour young women who are suffering from emotional turmoil, although a pioneer in poltergeist research claimed that it could be experienced by anyone. He added that he had witnessed cases in those as young as 8 and those as old as 78. There is no set time in which poltergeists seem to appear or leave. In some cases they may target a person for a few months, in others a few years. They are mostly thought to be the spirits of the dead and are believed to appear to those who have some sort of connection to, although this is not always the case. Overall, while cases of poltergeist hauntings are said to be the rarest form of haunting, they are also considered the most terrifying.